Hey guys, what is up, and I welcome you to a new League of Legends video. One of my favorite things to do on this channel with you guys is essentially talk to you guys about a champion in a certain meta. Is a champion maybe too overpowered, too underpowered, perfectly balanced, things like that. And I've already done a few of these for Rengar and Jhin, and I decided to make the topic of this video Zed. So essentially the question I'm asking and will be answering throughout this video is Zed overpowered right now? But right before we jump into the actual topic of the video, I want to ask you guys the exact same question. Do you think Zed is currently overpowered? Also, if you want me to make a video in the near future telling you guys how to counter or how to beat Zed, let me know by hitting that like button. So for this video, I'll be looking mainly at two parts or two different things. First, we'll look at things that make Zed seem overpowered, and then we'll take a look at things that do not make him seem overpowered. And after all of these facts are stated, at the end of the video, I will give you my personal thought and answer this question. Now, I feel like a very important thing to look at when talking about such a topic of a champion is, well, how is this champion even doing in general across most elos? What is the win ratios? What's the play ratios? Things like that. What is the general state of the champion? So taking a look here, you can see Zed's play rate in mid lane is actually the third highest of all mid lane champions, just over 16%. Now that's actually quite a bit of playtime he's receiving, and from all of this playtime, he's actually still sitting at a somewhat impressive 51.67% win rate in patch 6.3. Now these statistics we're looking at and that I'm showing you are for platinum and above. But this isn't really enough just to base how successful a champion is currently. Because another very important stat to take a look at is how many games does it take to start being successful with a champion. So with the graph you're looking at now, you can see that the more experienced you are with Zed, the higher your chances of winning. Now this behavior in this graph may seem very obvious to some people. Naturally you would have higher chances of winning if you are more experienced with the champion. But you would be surprised at how many champions only require a small handful of games in order to already be deemed successful at them. But then very recently we have the release of Duskblade of Dragthar. Now that was supposed to be considered an insanely strong item, especially on Zed. Yet his win ratio from the last patch and this patch is pretty much the same. Personally, I think this item is actually quite good on Zed, but only in very specific matchups and if you are doing well in lane and you want to further your snowball. So now that we got that more or less general information out of the way, let's take a look at reasons why Zed might be considered an overpowered champion for some people at the moment, or essentially, let's take a look at his strengths. So even especially ever since his changes to his W a few patches ago where the range was increased, his laning phase is and has been fantastic. But honestly, Zed historically has always had a strong laning phase. That's just what made Zed Zed. Of all the assassin champions, he has the safest and most dominant laning phase if played correctly. He has a good escape, he has nice ranged harass and poke. If he's a little bit ahead, his wave clear is surprisingly quite good, dealing some nice damage to the minions. He's obviously got plenty of mobility to either juke out a gank, maybe go in for kills, and a lot of people just feel very intimidated by the champion. Especially the person that has to face Zed in the mid lane. Zed, like pretty much every other assassin, is a snowbally champion. If you make a mistake, if you let him get the upper hand, he will capitalize off of that and he will continue to capitalize even further. Now, as someone that mains this champion, I have to agree, his laning phase is actually quite strong. And if you're inexperienced in mid lane or you're inexperienced with the matchup, it's definitely quite intimidating. He has a massive power spike at level 6 which can kill you if you overstep by just a little bit, and if you do, chances are you already lost your lane. But aside from his laning phase, other things that may seem overpowered about Zed is the fact that this champion makes the other mid laner have to play in a very specific way, especially if they're a mage. Now whether that is picking a champion specifically to counter him in the laning phase and or having to itemize specifically against him so that you don't die to his ultimate, to his all-in, and to his damage in the laning phase. It does feel like a lot of times you are forced to have to build in such ways, whether you like it or not, just to prevent Zed from snowballing off of you. So obviously a very common item on mages in the mid lane that are facing Zed is rushing Azania's Hourglass to counter his all-in and his ultimate. On top of just giving you the raw armor stats that his abilities and his auto attacks just simply do less damage. Now, him being able to force other champions to itemize solely against him obviously is a very strong trait, because on top of usually having to force the mid laner to buy Zhonya's just to counter you, the enemy ADC player will also be having to buy specific items just to play against you, such as maybe QSS Mercurial Scimitar or even something like Steric's Gauge. And all of this is done by either of the champions with the intent to counter Zed, because other than that, it's very hard to do it. Especially when we're talking about solo queue and people are not going to be picking champions that they don't want to play just for the sole purpose of beating or countering a champion. Most people in solo queue will just simply pick a champion that they want to play, whether or not it's a fantastic matchup or just a very mediocre one. But going back to that point, ADCs are also forced to buy items specifically when facing Zed, because in a teamfight, Zed is going to be gunning for either the ADC, maybe the mid laner, or any other potential squishy target. And if you do not have the items specific to countering Zed, or at least making it more difficult for him to kill you, you better hope you have the proper champions picked. And the final thing I'll talk about that might make Zed feel overpowered is the fear of his ultimate after the laning phase. So whether we're talking specifically about teamfights or maybe around 25 to 30 minutes of the game where Zed could be roaming to different lanes and trying to find targets by themselves. A very common example of this is if the enemy ADC is by themselves bot lane farming, maybe even somewhat close to their tower, thinking they're probably safe, and then Zed comes out of nowhere, ults them, and unless you are very ahead, you are probably gonna die. Or at the very least, have to blow at least one summoner spell. The amount of distance Zed is able to cover with his W plus his ultimate feels very difficult for other players to play against. But in my opinion, this concept is very similar to many other assassin champions, so maybe like Rengar or Talon. But on top of Zed being able to cover such distance and get to the target he wants to get to fairly easily, he also has a fairly good escape option with the second part of his ultimate, which is another reason why people feel very scared and annoyed when they have to face Zed, thinking that there's really nothing they can do about him. So those right there are probably the major reasons as to why a lot of people can look at Zed as an overpowered champion. But let's take a look at the opposite side of this story. What makes Zed feel not overpowered? So with his laning phase being so strong and forcing someone to rush an item against him, at the same time, I mean, you are stopping a lot of opportunities he will have to kill you by rushing that item. On top of there being a decent amount of champions that can make the laning phase for Zed much more difficult. At the end of the day, Zed again is an assassin, and assassins need to snowball, so preventing that in any way, shape or form is very important. If an assassin gets ahead by a lot, then it is of course naturally very difficult to deal with him around mid game, whether it's Zed, whether it's Talon, LeBlanc, Rengar, etc. That is what their kit is designed to do. But other things for Zed on top of the Zhonya's is obviously the QSS. Now in my opinion, this one isn't as bad as Zhonya's for Zed, but it still makes things much more difficult, especially if the ADC has mobility and escapes within their kit. So an example could be someone like Vayne, Lucian, or Ezreal. His teamfighting is very difficult to do successfully as well, and the longer the game goes, the harder it becomes for Zed to be useful. And in my opinion, this is the part of the game that really shows how good you are at Zed and separates the good Zeds from the bad ones. Any crowd control, especially in a teamfight, will make it very difficult for him, and it simply adds more layers he has to bypass in order to be useful. And if you're facing a coordinated team, so maybe some pre-made 5s or especially in competitive, I mean that just makes things even more difficult. And this is why usually you don't really see Zed very often in competitive play. Now a Zed that is a little ahead and that is also split pushing, this is where things can get a little difficult. But there are definitely champions that can beat him in a 1v1 scenario, but if you don't have any champions that can beat him in a 1v1 scenario, then this definitely will be kind of annoying to deal with. So for the most part, his weaknesses depend on the opponents, and that is for the most part how assassins work. Assassins capitalize off of enemy mistakes. Whether that is mistakes in the champion picks, or mechanical type mistakes, or even decision making mistakes. That is what assassins are designed to do. If you make a mistake, they're gonna capitalize off of it, and they're gonna continue doing that as long as you keep making more and more mistakes. And this is why it feels so difficult and so daunting facing assassin champions like Zed, because again, you are not allowed to make too many mistakes. So let's finally go back to the beginning of the video and revisit the initial question. Is Zed overpowered right now? In my honest, truthful opinion, no, I don't think he is overpowered, but on the other hand, I don't think he's underpowered either. To me, Zed is in a pretty good spot at the very moment, where he's definitely viable in certain games or if you have enough skill to play him to a certain level. But there are many ways to make Zed's life in a game much more difficult, you just have to know what they are. And I believe this applies to pretty much any assassin. Duskblade of Drakthar didn't really seem to have that much of an impact on Zed's overall power, but that could have been because of the nerf to his ultimate as the item came out. But personally for me, whenever I'm playing against a Zed in the mid lane, unless the player I'm facing is just flat out better than me, I don't really have too many issues. And that about wraps it up for this video, guys. If you did enjoy it, if you want me to make a video teaching you guys how to beat Zed or how to counter Zed, make sure to hit that like button. Also subscribe if you haven't, check out my other videos as well, and here are my favorite answers from the previous videos. Question: what champion do you want to see back in the meta? But I thank you all so much for watching, hope you learned something new or hope this video was entertaining, and I hope to see you for the next one as well. Peace.